Welcome to the empire of money, where money, history, and power collide. For most of human history, making money carried a dark, moral shadow. Today, we celebrate the hustle, the 100-hour workweek, and the relentless pursuit of financial freedom. But imagine living in a world where being rich wasn't a flex, it was a death sentence for your soul. Imagine a society where profit existed and trade flourished, but the very act of actively pursuing wealth was viewed with the same disgust we now reserve for the most heinous crimes. In medieval Europe, the highest spiritual ideal wasn't the successful entrepreneur, it was the monk who renounced every material possession to live in a stone cell. Working hard was admired, but getting rich from it was considered a spiritual failure. Charging interest was condemned as the sin of usury, and hoarding wealth was seen as pure, unadulterated greed. And yet, within a few centuries, this world of religious restriction would become the birthplace of modern capitalism, a system where relentless work, disciplined saving, and constant reinvestment were no longer morally suspicious, they were virtuous. To understand how we got trapped in the modern grind, we have to expose the religious revolution that rewired the human brain. To truly grasp the connection between power and capital, we need to step back into the world of late medieval Europe. Before the Protestant Reformation, economic life existed within a deeply Catholic moral universe. The church wasn't just a place of worship, it was the most powerful financial institution on the planet. It shaped how every human thought about work, wealth, and social responsibility. Medieval theology placed clear, rigid moral limits on how money could be used. The most famous example was the absolute prohibition against usury, charging interest on loans. The belief was simple: money is sterile. It shouldn't be able to generate more money just by sitting there. To modern ears, this sounds like a financial death wish, but in a world of slow-moving trade and agricultural stability, debt was seen as a weapon that could destroy entire communities. If you were a merchant, you operated under a cloud of guilt. You handled the gold, but you were never quite clean. This moral balancing act created a bizarre phenomenon among the elites. Take the Medici bankers of Renaissance Florence, for example. These men built one of the most powerful financial empires in history, handling accounts for kings and even the papacy itself. They were, by any definition, the original masters of the game. And yet, they lived in constant terror of the afterlife. This is the exposed truth behind the world's greatest art. The Medici weren't just patrons of beauty, they were buying spiritual insurance. The massive cathedrals, the stunning paintings, the hospitals, these were often desperate attempts to reconcile their massive fortunes with a religion that told them it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. They were playing a high-stakes game of power, but they were doing it while looking over their shoulders at a divine ledger they could never fully balance. Then, in 1517, a theological earthquake hit. A German monk named Martin Luther published 95 theses, and while history books focus on the religious split, the real power play was economic. Luther exposed a massive corruption scheme, the sale of indulgences. The church was literally selling get-out-of-hell-free cards to fund the lavish lifestyles of the Roman elite. It was a pay-to-play system that kept the masses in debt and the elites in power. But Luther's most radical move was redefining the concept of work. He argued that every job, from the blacksmith to the farmer to the merchant, was a calling. Suddenly, your 9-to-5 wasn't just a way to survive, it was a form of divine service. This was the first brick in the wall of the holy grind. Ordinary labor was no longer just tolerated, it was sanctified. But if Luther opened the door to the hustle, another man was about to lock the room and throw away the key. John Calvin, a French theologian in Geneva, introduced a concept that would create the most intense psychological pressure in human history: predestination. Calvin taught that God had already decided before the beginning of time who was saved and who was lost. There was nothing you could do to change your fate. No amount of prayer or charity mattered. This created a salvation anxiety that reached a fever pitch. Believers were desperate for a sign, any sign, that they were among the elect. They looked for evidence in their daily lives, and they found it in discipline, sobriety, and most importantly, financial success. If you were wealthy, it wasn't just luck, it was a leak from the divine record that you were one of the chosen ones. But here was the trap. You couldn't spend that money on yourself. Luxury was a sin. So you had to reinvest it. You had to grow the capital. You had to work harder. This wasn't just capitalism. It was a religious obsession that demanded you become a millionaire while living like a monk. This psychological glitch created a new kind of power, the power of capital accumulation. While the rest of the world spent their profits on palaces and wars, the Calvinists in the Netherlands and England were building a financial monster that would eventually swallow the globe. This led directly to the birth of the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. This wasn't just a trading firm, it was the world's first corporate empire. It had its own private army, its own navy, and the legal right to wage war and execute people. It was a shadow state fueled by the relentless reinvestment of profits. This was the moment history rhymed with the modern corporate world. The VOC created the first stock market in Amsterdam, where people traded shares with a frenzy that eventually led to the world's first massive financial bubble, tulip mania. People were trading their life savings for flower bulbs, driven by the same frantic energy we see in today's speculative markets. The patterns of the past were becoming clear. The Protestant ethic had normalized the systematic pursuit of profit. It was no longer about greed, it was about stewardship. By the time the Puritans landed in America, this mindset was woven into the very fabric of the New World. They brought with them a culture where idleness was the ultimate sin and productivity was the ultimate virtue. Over the centuries, the religious names changed, but the hustle remained. We eventually lost the original spiritual why, but we kept the mechanical how. This is what sociologist Max Weber called the iron cage. We became a society trapped in a relentless production and consumption, working ourselves to the bone not because we're afraid of hell, but because we don't know how to stop. We have built an empire of money, but we have become its most dedicated servants. In the modern world, we see these traps everywhere. Inflation hits your wallet because the system is designed to favor those who control the flow of capital, forcing you to run faster just to stay in the same place. We study these failures and power plays not just to understand history, but to achieve true financial sovereignty. Because when you understand that the grind was originally a coping mechanism for religious anxiety, you can start to break free from the psychological chains of the system. You can begin to master your money mindset by seeing it for what it truly is, a game of power and patterns. History has shown us that empires are built on beliefs, and they are lost when those beliefs become rigid and blind. By decoding these historical rhymes, you gain the master key to your own financial freedom. The transition from a world that feared wealth to a world that worships it didn't happen by accident. It was a series of calculated shifts, psychological pressures, and institutional power plays. The financial historian knows that nothing is ever as simple as it looks on a spreadsheet. Money isn't just paper or digits on a screen. It's a reflection of our deepest fears and our highest ambitions. As we look at the ruins of past empires and the bubbles of the past, we see the same human errors repeating under different names. If you want to avoid the traps that took down the titans of the past, you have to look beyond the surface. You have to understand the ghosts in the machine. If this deep dive into the hidden history of your paycheck gave you a new perspective on the empire of money, then you're ready for the next level. We are here to decode the patterns that keep most people trapped in the cycle of debt and dependency. History has the answers, and we are here to show you exactly where to find them.
Hit subscribe and join us as we continue to expose the flow of power through the financial system. Because in this empire, knowledge isn't just power, it's the only path to true sovereignty. Remember, the game has been played for centuries. It's time you learned the real rules. I'll see you in the next deep dive.